No one has ever questioned my loyalty. In return, I have never questioned my orders. For decades, my comrades and me have enacted the will of the Kremlin in places where the Kremlin could not be seen. We shed our colors, our names, our identity. We were all willing to die in complete anonymity for the greater good of the homeland. The weight of these sacrifices we have made were immeasurable, but necessary. We stopped this land from descending into chaos. We self-immolated ourselves at the altar of order and control, hoping that one day we would be remembered as heroes. They're all dead. Everyone who came with me to this cursed corner of the globe is dead, and I am left as the sole survivor of the horror we have witnessed. For nearly 2 decades, I have sat in this disgusting basement that smelled of death waiting for a word from my superiors. I have spent years waiting for some sort of debriefing, some sort of explanation for what had happened that fateful night. I expected someone to come and bring me back home. I expected proper treatment for my wounds, a pension, at least a quiet recognition of my loyalty. But none came. My superiors have abandoned me and left me to rot. I swore an oath to never speak of any of the operations that I was a part of. But what good is a loyal man's oath when he swears it to thieves and liars? Perhaps me writing this post will result in an unfortunate fall from a window, or a heart attack delivered by the tip of an umbrella. If that is the case, then so be it. Every man must die, and I would rather die by state-sponsored violence than because of what lingers beneath my bandages. I used to do wet work for the Russian military. I am the sole survivor of this event. This is my story. It was the summer of 2002 and I had been dispatched beyond the new borders to Central Asia. As usual, everyone on the team was given a local passport and false documentation. If we were to be caught there would be no connection to a foreign government. For all intents and purposes, I belonged to a group of concerned local citizens who had access to high-grade military equipment. The area that we were meant to be concerned about was the building formerly known as the United People's Institute of Science. In its former glory, the United People's Institute of Science was one of the most revered Soviet scientific installations. The greatest minds of the East all gathered in a single underground facility and researched concepts that would help these Soviets get an upper hand in the war. The Institute always operated on a relatively self-governing basis. Yet, once the borders of our sphere of influence started to readjust in 1989, communication with the facility went completely dark. There were bigger problems than rogue scientific installations after the wall fell. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed, any paperwork concerning the Institute's existence went to rot, in archives that few would ever visit. Official oversight over the Institute ceased to exist, yet the facility continued to operate in its own special way. The rumors were a mainstay of local gossip. Stories of insane scientists, of disappearances, of strange creatures roaming the woods. Nothing very alarming for an uneducated community next to a secret research facility. Aside from the Institute, the only other notable things in the nearest city were a handful of factories and an old burned-down hotel. Bored people in desolate conditions tend to have colorful imaginations. For decades, the rumors were ignored. After '91, however, the talk about the Institute changed. For one, it was no longer referred to as the Institute. To the locals, the building was now known as Scientific Installations. The rumors, much like the name, changed in their form. The locals no longer spoke of vague monsters and ethereal plots. They spoke of specific missing people, of livestock showing up bloodless in the fields, of a specific part of the forest from which none returned. The locals' abstract stories hardened into matching descriptions. When digital cameras became cheap enough to be a hobbyist item, the photographs started to emerge. They were grainy and there were no guarantees that they weren't doctored. Yet at this point, these scientific installations started to catch the attention of the decision makers. The rumors caught the eye of those in power, yet on closer inspection, there was something more concerning about the institute. According to the few official documents that could be unearthed, the United People's Institute of Science was not just a research facility. There were 2 missile silos attached to the structure as well. This so-called scientific installation was deemed a threat to national security. The channels from the provincial government pointed to a culture of drunkenness and ineptitude. We were brought to the city without any express permission from anyone noteworthy. Our mission was to assess and take control of the scientific installations. If we were to be caught or killed, we would forever be known as very concerned citizens. We were organized into a 12-man team. Our handler had set us up in the basement of a hospice. I didn't recognize any of the men present except for one, the Siberiac. 2 years prior, we had both been a part of a messy operation near the Mongolian border where he had saved my life. I have met a lot of dangerous men throughout my career, but the Siberiac towered over them all, both in stature and in capacity for violence. The directives for our mission were vague at best, but knowing that the Siberian giant was on our side, it eased my mind. I had seen him kill. As long as he was on the same side as me, I considered myself safe. Even though we were in the basement of the hospice, the cries of the sick still reached our ears. I joined the rest of the team in a friendly game of cards and some light drinking, using a radio to drown out the wails of the dying. The mood of the basement was reasonably calm. Everyone was blowing off steam before the mission, with one exception. The Siberiac did not join us for the card game or the vodka. He simply sat at the top of the stairs, listening to the pain of strangers. It's as if he knew he would soon join them in their torture. The United People's Institute of Science was a primarily subterranean structure with only a guardhouse and a small lobby, with an elevator shaft leading down. The plan was simple. 2 men were to covertly make their way to the guardhouse, neutralize the sole member of security, and then the rest of the team was meant to advance towards the Institute under the cover of night. The operation was a mess from the beginning. The 2 men chosen to deal with the security guard were young and indecisive, and the security guard himself acted erratically. Most civilians immediately cooperated at the sight of a rifle. This security guard did not. As soon as the 2 greenhorns approached, he started yelling about them having no authority here. Instead of surrendering, he picked up the phone and he called his supervisor. By the time they shot him, he had alerted the Institute to trouble. The monotone voice of the commanding officer in our earpieces ordered us to advance on the facility. It was a pitch-dark night, with not even a hint of the moon in the sky, and yet the night vision goggles turned the incomprehensible dark into a navigatable sea of grainy green. The Institute was located in the middle of a dense forest, yet the land around the actual structure was completely barren. There was no cover. We were like heavily armed lambs moving towards a dead quiet slaughterhouse. An announcement of our arrival was not optimal, but the sort of work I was in rarely went according to plan. Robbed of the element of surprise, we moved on the Institute from opposing directions in 2 groups of 5. I was in the back of the eastern formation with the Siberiac directly in front of me. The hulking giant offset any discomfort I had at the announcement of our arrival. I thought myself safe. As we moved across the dead ground, my earpiece sounded off with the commander's voice and the occasional whispered apology from the guardhouse group. No movement from the Institute. For a moment, I found myself experiencing something akin to calmness. And then I heard a voice in my earpiece that didn't belong there.
Tovarishki, turn back.
A female voice, a calm voice, a motherly voice.
Tovarishki, turn back or, in the name of the Institute, I will be forced to take drastic action.
No one stopped. The fact that an outsider was able to speak on our frequency was highly unusual. but we knew better than to pay attention to orders that didn't come from our superior. We moved to the backup frequency, but the voice followed, and its tone had changed.
Tovarishki,
She said in a voice so cold and sharp that it made even the Siberian before me twitch.
this is your last warning. If you keep approaching, you will find a fate worse than death. Turn back and never return.
I have never disobeyed an order. I take pride in the fact that I am a reliable member of the armed forces. But that voice, there is something unearthly in it, something horribly malicious that I cannot comprehend. My rifle started to shake. My steps became uneasy. For the first time since I had enlisted, I found myself truly disturbed.
Tovary.
I ripped my earpiece out. Even now as I write this, I cannot explain what I thought becoming deaf to the voice would achieve. I ripped out my earpiece in blind instinct, in a frenzied attempt to retreat from that which poisoned my soul with fear. The Siberiac kept on moving. In the field of chorus green, I could see the rest of the troop progressing as well. I was only a meter or two behind the formation, but it was clear I was the only one who had lost their composure. With shame in my heart, I tried to catch up with the rest of the group. Tovarishki, a dark, horrid voice boomed through my head. You have been warned. You have refused to see reason. Now you shall pay the price. My earpiece was out. It was as if the foreign voice had been lodged into my skull. Before my mind had even managed to properly register the psychic intrusion, there was something else to contend with. The ground beneath us shook. The earth swallowed in a dark circle around the Institute and it caved in. I saw my comrades fall into a sudden ditch of murky water. My nose filled with the smell of an infected wound. Whatever liquid they had fallen into was potent with filth. If I had been standing behind the Siberiac, as I was meant to, I would have fallen as well. I would have ended up in that same horrid water as everyone else did. My moment of hesitation is the only reason why I survived that night. The Siberiac screamed. As terrified as I was, I quickly reached down and offered him a helping hand. The man had saved my life a couple years prior. It was only fitting that I would help him out of the ditch that he had fallen into. Getting the giant out of the water proved to be much more strenuous than expected. His weight was quite a burden to contend with, and much like the rest of the team, he was thrashing around in the water, unable to stand up on his own. To help him out, I had to descend into the ditch myself and plant one foot into the water for leverage. This helped the Siberiac up, but as soon as my boots submerged in the water, I could understand what all of the thrashing was about. Just a bit of the dark water got into my boot, but the pain was instant. The liquid was cold, but the moment it soaked through my sock, it was as if I was standing on burning coals. The stench of sickness and the pain seized me so strongly that I nearly vomited. Yet I kept my composure and crawled out of the ditch along with the rest of my comrades. Our commander was yelling orders for us to advance in the facility, yet his orders were soon drowned out. You have angered forces which you cannot comprehend. You will feel the wrath of it. The doors of the facility flew open. The instinct to open fire came as quickly as the order did. Bright flashes broke through the world of green. The quiet forest filled with the sound of gunfire. Yet by the time our rifles went quiet, nothing had changed. We stood there in silence, facing down the cement building in the middle of a forest, with nothing but the echo of our guns to keep us company. And that's when I noticed that the Siberiac was shaking. One of his hands was off his weapon and scratching across his back. He wasn't the only one. The rest of the team, even those approaching the Institute from the opposite side, were all clawing at their bodies. Weapons started to fall to the ground. The scratching amplified to manic fits. We were no longer a group of soldiers ready for combat. The Siberiac turned around and faced me. I have seen many things throughout my life, things that would force most civilians into eternal sleepiness, yet nothing compares to the sight of the Siberiac's face that night. His usually vacant gray eyes were filled to the brim with fear. His face was covered in dark red splotches that seemed like the aftermath of some horrid childhood accident. Out of those crimson marks came writhing life. Worms. Frenzied worms with small black eyes stemmed from his face, pulling further and further out of his body. He opened his mouth to scream, but his jaw, it too, was filled with the parasites. And the Siberiac was not the only one. All around me, my comrades were trying to rip away the foreign life crawling out of their skin. They tried to scream, yet all their wide open mouths let out were whimpers and more of those writhing maggots. Tovarishki, you have not heeded my warnings and now you will pay the price. The voice boomed in my skull. The Institute is not to be trifled with. Something squeezed its way out of the doors of the Institute. I raised my rifle to fire, yet my eye slipped to the ground. The thing was moving towards our group, but I couldn't. I just couldn't stand to look at it. It moved towards us, and I could see my comrades were suffering. I could see that they needed help, yet I couldn't face the horrid creature that left that cursed place. I ran as fast as I could to save my life. Flesh, bone, blood. As I looked over my shoulder, I couldn't tell where the remnants of my comrades ended and where the beast began. I ran blindly into the forest, hoping that whatever was doing this to my brothers at arms wouldn't follow me. It didn't. Yet as my struggling breath reached its limits, another problem presented itself. Even though my body was shivering with adrenaline, the burning pain in my foot was starting to make itself known again. I hid next to a forest stream, with my rifle at the ready, and I kicked off my boot. Beneath my sock, a mess of life squirmed. The worms. It was these same exact worms that had consumed the Siberiac just moments before. They were consuming my foot and slowly spreading towards my calf. Instinct. The same instinct that forced me to rip out my earpiece was now driving me to act. I found a piece of wood by the stream, and I fished out my combat knife. I placed the wood in my mouth and I bit down. I knew what I had to do, but I also knew that if the beast that was lurking by these scientific installations would hear me, all of my pain would be worthless. The details of how I made my way back to the hospice escape me. My handler kept me on enough morphine for the whole month after the mission to stay a distant memory. I loosely recall pulling my body through the jagged gravel of a road towards the city. I loosely recall being loaded into the back of a car. I loosely recall the surgery to amputate the rest of my leg. What I do remember with absolute clarity is my handler thanking me for my service and asking me to stay put until someone comes to retrieve me. That was almost 2 decades ago. I recall that promise with sharp memory because I have thought about it each and every night. I have been loyal. I have waited. I have even tried to establish contact with the local embassy, yet no one will claim me. For years, I have been a man living in the basement of a hospice, praying that I will not have to die here. Yet those illusions are starting to leave me. Beneath my bandages, I can feel it again. The worms. The amputation has only slowed their progress. Beneath my bandages, I can feel them wriggling again. They have come to finish what they started during that fateful day